Welcome to the Melodology podcast, celebrating the unsung excellence of melody makers. My name is Arthur Breur. I am your host. I am a huge fanatic of melodies. I am a melodic composer myself, and I am really loving the opportunity to explore music that is brought to me by other composers, that is music that they find interesting and exciting and appealing. And you'll see from the previous episodes, a lot of the composers have been very excited and very interested in the music that they brought. We have the same situation today with my guest composer, Aaron Lee. A devotee of lifelong learning and lifelong music making, Aaron Lee is always on the lookout for new opportunities to expand his musical horizons. From concert music to soundtracks to electroacoustic performance art, he's interested in just about all things musical. In addition to his work as a composer and arranger, he also makes sure to find time to create music as a performer, as a singer in concert settings. Welcome to the Melodology podcast, Aaron. How are you today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Tell me about your background in music, growing up, early memories, and so forth.
Well, I came from a, somewhat musical family in that both my parents both started to pursue music in academia, though from what I've heard, neither of them finished their first year. So I came from a family that appreciated music, but that didn't necessarily have a ton of technical knowledge about it. And obviously this is before my first memory, but I remember being told that as a child I would apparently try to sing along with the three tenors or conduct Beethoven symphonies. Earlier memories, classical music was just always in the house. I remember also growing up in a German family. It's a lot of Strauss. Waltzes everywhere.
Do you have an early memory of any particular melody?
Probably the Blue Danube Waltz and the Radetzky March, just because it was tradition and still is in my family to watch the Vienna New Year's concert every year. Those are played, those two, at the end of the concert every year.
Of course. Well, and everybody claps along with the march. And
exactly.
Tell me about your experience as a composer. What brought you to want to create music?
Truthfully, I don't know what really initially prompted it. I remember still being in elementary school when I just thought, I found that there was a free version of Finale at the time. I thought, why not just try? I had been taking piano lessons for a couple of years at that point. So I thought, why not? Could be fun. And I just enjoyed it. Writing stuff sort of as a hobby for years until I eventually started to pursue it at university.
What would you say your influences are as far as the foundations of your composing style?
Honestly, it's a challenge to nail it down because it's changed so much over the years. I would say one of my initial big influences would have been Shostakovich, and some of the earlier, like Piazzolla stuff, would have been very influential to me.
And of course, the question, do you like film scores?
Yes, I really like film scores. So my favorites, I have to admit, they might not count as strictly film scores because they're often musicals as well, but sort of the 90s Disney stuff, like Alan Menken's work.
They actually have music that's the music behind the scenes, right, but they have songs too. And I would absolutely consider the songs in those as part of the score. And great choice. Those musicals, the Menken and Ashman scores and lyrics are some of the best of all time. They are just absolute classic music and classic words to go right along with the melodies.
I think my favorite actually is Hunchback of Notre Dame, which I don't think is an Ashman one anymore. I think that's actually Menken and Schwartz.
But still, yeah, anytime Menken is writing music, it tends to be just fantastic melodies, very catchy and very functional. Very, you listen to them and they do the job that particular moment in the story needs a song to do.
Well, he manages to write melodies that are multifunctional. Like he manages to have ones that can be manipulated well, that they show up throughout the hour and a half, maybe just up to 2 hour duration of the film. They're very practical, I find.
And that is a trick too. I mean, composing a melody in the first place is a skill, but then composing a melody that you can take parts of it in different ways. So, John Williams does this amazingly well because he writes with motifs so much. He writes with tiny little bits of music, and Menken does as well. where you have like maybe 3 notes that are part of the melody, and you take those 3 notes and those become a callback to a person or to a thought later in the movie. But just that little motif from the overall melody is the thing that he's using to reference somebody or something. And then another thing about composing for being able to reuse stuff like that is composing in such a way that it can be major or minor, sound melancholy or happy, change it a little bit, but still have it be recognizable as that motif, but have a different feel to just the way that the notes go.
Yeah, right. Just choosing the things so that you can pull out different motifs at different points. There's a lot that goes into just crafting, those 5 to 8 seconds of music to make it sort of versatile through the whole duration.
And there's a lot of unsung excellence in that too. We will be looking at lots and lots of film scores as we are doing this podcast. At this point, as of now, we've already looked at 2 film score themes and 1 television theme, as well as another Disney song. So we definitely have our feet in that area of music. Today, we're going to be doing something different, though. This is different in the way that this is a folk tune we're going to be talking about today. And we've already done some music that would qualify as traditional melodies. Today's melody is a Jewish folk tune. Tell us about the piece of music that you are bringing today, Aaron.
So today it's the supposedly Yiddish folk song of Seit Gesunderhait, Meine, Liebe, Eltern, which supposedly from what I've read and gathered, it's about a bride saying goodbye, farewell to her parents as she leaves off to move on with her life. And so as such, there is a bit of melancholy, a bit of, mixed emotions. Even though it is ultimately a happy day, there's some sadness added in. So it's, I think, a lovely, sort of complicated theme for a song such as this.
Now, you have an interesting story also about where you discovered this piece of music.
Right, so I first came across it in Prokofiev's Overture on Hebrew Themes, which was a piece he was commissioned to write by Simeon Belisson, who was a clarinetist, contemporary of Prokofiev, who commissioned Prokofiev to write this piece for his chamber ensemble. And there is some debate as to whether or not this is therefore a real, I don't know what would qualify as fake, but a real traditional Yiddish folk song, in that supposedly Belisson handed Prokofiev a book, a notebook of what he called traditional Hebrew and Yiddish folk music. And from what I've read, a lot of academic research since then has not been able to verify the origin of a lot of those tunes. So there is some debate that perhaps Belisson just wrote many of them, potentially including this one, himself.
And we did find sheet music for it that's published in 1920, but you were telling me earlier that Prokofiev's piece was published in 1919. So there's no proof just from the sheet music that we have as to anything other than that. And the sheet music refers to it as a Jewish folk song and refers to it as Farewell, My Dear Parents. Again, we don't have any evidence prior to that.
And that sheet music provides an arranger that's not Belisson or Prokofiev, so who knows?
Tell us what intrigued you about the melody when you heard it. What caught your attention about it?
I think what first leaped out at me is that it's ultimately what I would refer to as a sparse melody. There's not that much going on at any one moment. It's not like there's a ton of enormous leaps or anything sort of very florid or fancy, but it's just very sort of drawn out, slow, sort of very emotive. And it does make use of to sort of more Western ears, a less traditional scale, less traditional set of notes.
We'll talk about the scale that it uses after we take a break. It is considered a traditional Jewish mode of music or scale. It has a very distinct sound that I think is really interesting. It's going to sound different from all the melodies we've listened to so far. And it fits a little less in what I would consider the standard mode of Western music. Usually Western music, you're dealing with major and minor scales. If you are dealing with anything that's slightly distinct, it might be the harmonic minor, which has a leap, or an augmented second leap instead of just regular minor or major seconds in the scale. So it has a very different sound. And that's going to be really apparent as well. Anything else you'd like to say about the melody before we go ahead and take a break and then come back and look at it?
Just that It's interesting to me to note that, because I used this in one of my own pieces a few years back, and in research then, it was near impossible to find anything about this, any recordings. So I'm just glad also to see that it's actually become a little more prominent, perhaps. Still not especially prominent by any stretch, but now that there is actually possible to find some recordings, a score for. So I like the fact that this kind of music is coming a little more to the fore again.
Yeah, the trick that I had when you told me the name of it was going and looking, for example, searching for it on YouTube, which will include links to a couple performances in the show notes. But on YouTube, it was spelled differently than you provided it. By putting in a couple of different spellings, I was able to find a couple of different performances. And there's not a lot out there that has it, but it's interesting that maybe now it's going to be performed more or catching some zeitgeist.
I suppose it is worth noting that this is written in Yiddish originally. And so what we're reading when we read the language, for those who can't see the screen, is a sort of anglicization of the original, because it would have been written with a Hebrew text, like Hebrew alphabet.
Yeah, and the sheet music that we have is American published sheet music. And again, I will link to that. You can see the cover here if you are watching the video. Again, the video is available on our Patreon. If you want to see the things that we're talking about, look at the melody as we're looking at it and so forth, the full video will be on our Patreon channel. Anything else you'd like to cover before we take a quick break?
No, I think that's sort of good to take a break and then come back ready to dive in.
All right. Welcome back to the Melodology podcast. My name is Arthur Breur. I am your host, and I am here today with composer Aaron Lee, and we are talking about a piece called Farewell, My Dear Parents. I'll let you pronounce the Yiddish version.
And I'll do my best. I don't speak Yiddish. Seit Gesunderhait, Meine, Liebe, Eltern.
This piece, we were talking about the scale that it's in. And we want to make sure for the listeners that we have who are not musicians or not necessarily familiar with music theory, that we're dealing with a different scale today. What we're dealing with today is a scale that, if you want the really esoteric name for it, it is the Phrygian dominant scale. It is a minor scale with a flat second and a major third. And the way that you can get this scale from other kind of standard scales is if you start with a harmonic minor scale. And the harmonic minor scale sounds like this. If you start on the fifth note of that scale, then you have this scale that we're talking about today. So that puts this note as the tonic of the scale, but you have this flat second, but a major third. And it creates a very different sound. To me, I always thought that this sounded like it was intended to sound like it wasn't done. Like jazz will end on a chord that's, it's not the final comfortable tonic chord and everything resolves happy. It's jazz often lands on these chords that are just complex and interesting, and the music hangs there. And I always thought that this scale always, to me, has sounded like it's still hanging at the end of it. For example, probably the most famous piece that people will know about in this scale is Hava Nagila. And to me, it always sounded like the point of Hava Nagila, because if you're celebrating and you're dancing to it, you're dancing the grapevine and it just goes on and on and on and you keep dancing. I thought that it was intended to sound like it wasn't done because it was actually landing on the fifth note of the scale instead of ever resolving. But that's not the way this scale works. This scale is resolved when it lands on that note. So that's done. That's where the piece ends. So it's different from what we have in our popular music, and in much of classical Western music, it sounds different because we have so much that's in regular major and minor scales that don't have that augmented second between the flat second note of the scale and the major third. Did I do a pretty good job on that, do you think, Aaron?
I think so. What we're calling it the Phrygian dominant, one of those big convoluted music terms that theorists tend to like, is commonly used in jazz nowadays. It does show up a lot in sort of bebop and sort of jazz tunes, but it does have a much older history than that, just not necessarily in the sort of westernized music that a lot of us are used to. And it goes back to the sort of old Hebrew religious modes for the old traditional Hebrew religious music, much like the Christian church has its traditional older forms of music. It had specific scales that they used, which then changed over time slightly to become the ones we're now used to, major and minor scales. So too did these other religions have their own traditions, and some of those, the Hebrew one in particular in this case, developed into this.
I'm going to read a little bit from the Wikipedia page, which I will link on this. The scale occurs in Indian, Middle Eastern, Eastern European, Central Asian, and flamenco music. It's common in Arabic and Egyptian music, in which it's called Hijaz Nahawand or Hijaz Makam, and it's used in Hebrew prayers and klezmer music, where it's known as Avaha Rabbah, Phrygish, or just the Jewish scale. So this is kind of one of those things where it's a very commonly used scale, just not in our traditional Western music so much.
Right. And to me, I don't have an answer for this, but it's interesting as to why that would have happened, why so much of the world has this as just a very normal sound, and yet it's so unusual to us.
We can blame it on the dead Germans.
Of course.
Let's go ahead and jump into this melody. And we're going to do the same process we do. And again, if you want to watch what we're looking at, look at it on our Patreon. But we're going to go ahead and take a look at the melody and listen to it and see what we experience as we're looking through the notes, see what things we find, what compositional techniques are being used, the whole arc of the melody, that sort of stuff. But we're going to walk along it like we are walking along a path, and it's something that we have never seen before. Let's go ahead and listen to just the first part of it. That's all I'm going to do so far. What are you noticing about this melody?
Well, just starting like right off the bat, we have that opening leap. You have the tonic notes, or this root home note. This is the very first note. So far, so common, so good. But then it immediately leaps up to this note that, once we arrive in the next bar, isn't actually a part of the chord anymore. So it's immediately leaping to a dissonant note as part of the pickup.
And I think it's an interesting thing here because we have talked about writing melodies that are vocal melodies. And when you're doing a leap, you want to do a leap that's on the scale. So this is a perfect fifth, leaping from F sharp to C sharp in the key that we're looking at this. And that fifth is in that key, so it's okay to do that jump. It then, from there on, does everything pretty much step by step or in small leaps. So we have, again, that opening section. So there's that leap, but then from there on, everything else is by step or by just a leap of a third. In that third measure there, we hear that augmented second, that kind of different interval that's still stepwise. If you're looking at the notes, you still see that the notes are going step by step, but it's what's called an augmented second. It's 1/2 step larger than a major second. It's the same thing as a minor third. So it qualifies as a jump in some scales, but in this scale, it's technically a step, which I think is that kind of blows my mind up from a music theory point of view.
Yeah, and I guess just to throw in a bit of music theory jargon, that's what we would refer to as enharmonic. It's two things that are, in this case, spelled, I guess we'd say, differently, but sound the exact same.
Yeah, you can take any interval and augment it by making it a little bit bigger, and then it becomes the same as another interval, or another interval that perhaps has been diminished by a half step or by a whole step. So, I mean, there's just by adding sharps and adding flats in the notation, by raising a half step or raising or lowering a half step, you end up with the same intervals, but how are they being used? So in this case, we have an augmented second that's being used as a step in our scale. specifically when we get to here. It just has that extra spice, I guess I would say, to the sound of it.
If this wasn't in that mode, we could play it in just regular minor scale, and it wouldn't sound that remarkable. It wouldn't sound out of character for a lot of vocal music.
All right, so let's just do that real quick. This is what it would sound like if it were not in this scale. Which I don't think sounds anywhere near as interesting.
No, it doesn't. It just sounds much more, I don't know, almost too familiar, too simple.
It doesn't stand out. The melody doesn't have anything about it when it's just in minor that makes it really draw attention to itself. I will point out, the melody follows the tendency of music to be stretchy in that you start out on the first note of the scale, you leap up to the fifth, and then it gradually stretches it back down close to where we started. So we have that feeling of starting out at a certain spot, reaching away, and then the music bringing us back almost to where we were. And in this case, it ends on the seventh of the scale. And so it doesn't quite land at home at the end of that first phrase.
It's interesting to me. I don't know how in depth we want to get into sort of the craft of designing a melody, but that initial leap could have been just F sharp to B, and it wouldn't have functionally changed much about the melody, but it would have been more boring. So just by making the listener wait a little longer just for that B, the note they know is coming, internally, intuitively, but making them wait a little longer, we sort of do that same idea. We sort of prolong and stretch out the inevitable thing, that thing that we know is coming, but we just don't quite give it to them yet.
Right. And something else to note for our listeners, so we've talked about the perfect fifth being a heroic sounding interval. That first interval in this piece is a perfect fifth. And I would say because of the speed of the melody or the kind of pacing of the melody and the position of it, how it doesn't actually continue doing any leaps or anything like that, this particular opening does not sound heroic in any way. It's not actually being used in a way to be exuberant or something like that. It amazes me that exactly the same interval can sound so different in different circumstances.
Right, this really is, like you said, it leaps up at the first bit, but then it's just gradually working its way back down. With very little exception, it's just sort of slowly sliding back down to where it started.
Yeah. There are a couple situations where there are, if we want to consider a step away and then reversing by a third, there's a spot, where that's kind of done upside down. The beginning of the second measure has C to B to D. The end of the third measure has F to G to E. So it could be, that could be something that is a motif that's in there. But definitely very vocal in the fact that it does go step by step as it kind of, wanders its way back down. So let's listen to the first part of that, and then let's let it run into the second phrase of the piece. So now we've got this new, it's technically a new motif, repeats with a little bit of variation between the first and second measure of this phrase and then the third and fourth. Would you see that as being a phrase on its own repeated, or is that four measures one long phrase?
See, I think I view this as one big sort of 8-bar phrase.
Okay.
To be honest, like right from the beginning up to here. And that last little bit is what I would call sort of a little cadential extension. So in music terms, a cadence is just sort of building up to that resting spot in music.
Mm-hmm. I can imagine it as being 6 bars with emphasis on the last two measures, like repeating the last two measures because they were important melodically.
Yeah, I can see that.
And a lot of times, again, in Western music, in the more traditional music, it's kind of common that you have 4-measure phrases that repeat in groups of 4-measure phrases, which makes it poetic, and it makes it something where you've got a pattern that's repeating and it's kind of nice and easy and symmetrical. But in lots of different music traditions, you don't have that same expectation of there being a fixed number of measures that repeats the same number of measures each time. In some cases, you can have odd numbers of measures that just don't repeat the same things twice. You can have melodies that are longer or shorter than what we expect in kind of the song form that we're very much used to in popular music. So in this case, to me, it feels like the phrase ends after 6 bars, but then they kind of repeat the idea of the last 2 measures for emphasis.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. I do think that these last 4 bars, or the same 2 bars twice, depending on how you want to look at it, does still borrow a lot from the initial bit in terms of motifs, like even the ones we already talked about.
Yeah, just looking at it, you can see in the second measure, we've got that step down, leap up a third. And here, it kind of does the same thing where it starts and then it goes a step down, but it does a run up, does a scale up to that next note up instead of leaping. Again, you have a step up and step back down. It's still repeating patterns that are in the first couple measures of the melody.
Well, and even to the point where it's the start on tonic, start on your root note, leap up, and then fall back down to the third on the second measure.
And in this part, you are in fact getting the F to B that you'd mentioned earlier, how it would make it sound different. In this part of the melody, you are having it go from F to B instead of from F to C. Part of the quote unquote rules of writing a melody, when you have a leap, very often it feels more comfortable to move back down. And in this case, you are moving back down from the leap, but you have a little bit of a detour before you bring that note back down. So you're jumping up to the fourth and then coming back down to the third, even though you kind of have this little motion that takes you up a step and then back down to the third.
Right. I think actually in some ways it's interesting to look at these. So those last 2 bars, repeated section, is almost like a little mini summary of the first 4 bars. Takes the sort of big ideas and just compresses them into 2 bars instead of 4. This is a good time to segue a little into the fact that this melody will land and end on that third scale degree a lot.
Right.
As we also mentioned earlier, Hava Nagila, the other prominent tune that uses this, does that a lot as well. And that is just a trend with this scale, especially as it's used in Hebrew and Yiddish folk or traditional music.
It's the major third sound. If you were just taking 1, 3, and 5, the home chord of this scale, it's a major chord. The things about this particular scale or this mode that are different are the fact that you have that flat second, and then you have the flat 6th and 7th. So you don't have a leading tone that's right a half step below the home note. So you don't really have anything coming up from below to push you to the home note. And in fact, it's almost as if there's a reverse leading tone because you have the flat second that wants to pull back down to the home note. You still have a half step down from the 4th note down to the 3rd note. It naturally wants to pull back down from 4 to 3 because it's a closer thing. And again, I will point out that I've done these illustrations of scales as a stair step, where you actually have large steps and small steps kind of side by side, and you can choose to walk up, you can choose to jump from one place to a landing. I refer to the notes of a chord as landings on the scale. So you can jump up a third to land on the major third, and then there's a tiny step up to the 4th, and it's really easy to step back down that tiny step from the 4th to the 3rd. The fact that you're very close makes it easy to just pull back down that little bit. And I think in this case, this scale kind of feels like it has an upward leading tone. It leads from the top down to the tonic, because it does not feel like it pulls up from the 7th note. And again, the 7th is where this first phrase ends. This first phrase here that ends on the 7th of the scale, but it doesn't necessarily sound like it really wants to pull back up really strongly to the tonic in my ear.
No, it does feel fairly grounded there.
It feels like it's comfortable where it was, like it doesn't have a tension to bring it back to the home. Whereas when you play this phrase, It feels like there is a tension to get back down to that third. From the fourth, from this note to this note, it sounds like it wants to resolve that direction.
I think that's a good way to put it, is just that, those semitones, the small steps, you said, are just easier. And, like the rest of us, music tends to want to do what's easiest. That's what we tend to feel.
Yep. All right, so let's go ahead and move to the last phrase of the piece and all the way to the end. So what are you noticing in this stretch of the melody?
Well, for a starting point, the previous highest point, I was going to say the highest point we ever got, technically I think we got up to a D before, just for a briefest of moments.
Mm-hmm.
But for the majority, the highest we ever got was that C sharp. And instead of it being the high point we're leaping to, it's our starting point. So we've sort of taken up, I guess, the intensity, you'd say. Already ratcheted it up just for the second phrase.
Because we don't have that leading tone, that leap that goes up to the F, we get up to the E, but then that leap up to the F feels bigger and feels more like a more grand gesture because we don't have that leading tone that goes up there. And that's this sound here. It feels a little bit bigger because you don't have that leading tone that's almost going to take you there in the first place. But this measure, other than the drop down to the C, is essentially a scale up and down from C to F back down to C.
Right, and it's actually interesting to me that it's in some ways the reverse of what we had before we were starting on F sharp and leaping up to the C sharp, and here we're on the C sharp and moving up to the F sharp. This time, like you said, by a scale instead of leaping. It's the same idea of just starting at one point and going to the other. So like those are our two end points that we keep oscillating between.
I noticed that leap adds emphasis to the F. Not only does it feel like it's more of a leap because it doesn't have the leading tone to get there, instead of just going up the scale step by step and getting there, it's like goes up the scale, leans back down, and then jumps, which is another melodic technique to put emphasis on a particular note. We noticed that a lot when we were talking about the force theme in episode 7, that the melody goes up and then it jumps back down and then it leaps up even farther. In this case, we have a situation again where the melody could just go up and do a scale up to F, repeat F twice, and then scale back down. But it wouldn't necessarily feel like there was as much excitement of getting to that note if it did that. And I feel like the leap gives that note that excitement.
It's an interesting sort of practical dilemma or consideration, I suppose, when writing a melody, in that here we have something that, we have C sharp, we want to get to F sharp, and we want to do it in 2 beats, for example. That doesn't divide evenly. So we could do the, C, D, E, hold the E for a quarter note, F. You might do C sharp, D sharp, E, E sharp, F sharp. So you sort of just put in a little middle note.
A little slide to make it closer, yeah.
Or, repeat the F sharp. So there's a bunch of things you could do. And so here the choice was, we've gone C, D, E. Well, let's just quickly summarize that again and just do C, F, just to emphasize that, yes, this is the direction we're going. We're from here to here.
I am going to point out, as a composer, there is a lot of my music that has been determined by where I wanted to get and how far I had to go or how much time I had to get there. I'm just assuming this is an experience that lots of other composers have, that I know I want to get to a certain note or a certain chord at a certain place. And I know I've got 8 notes to get there, or I've got 3 bars to get there or something like that. And I have to kind of plan backwards from that note so that when I get to that note, it's a satisfying arrival to have gotten there. And sometimes it creates some of the most interesting parts of music in the planning on how you're going to arrive someplace.
To me, it's sort of the crux of how some of the different genres and styles of composing over the years have differed. For this being a more traditional folk option, how I mentioned doing that slide up, that's not really stylistically an option here. That would be very out of place in something like this.
Right. So back to looking at the second measure of this phrase, it repeats what the first phrase of the piece does, or the melody. It goes down and ends on that seventh note, one step below the tonic of our scale.
I'll say it's very similar, like you said, to that second bar of the very first iteration.
It has a little bit different rhythm going on. So here's the first time it does that. And here's what we have in the second measure of the final phrase. It does land in the same place. It gets there a little bit differently. There's more going on. It has farther to go to get there. But I would say that's absolutely a callback to the first phrase.
Well, and even to the point that on the sort of strong beats of the bar, the same notes happen.
Right. Yeah. Another thing that I'm noticing here, looking at these measures, is it's kind of a clever stepwise motion down. Even though we go all the way up to that F, the measure here is starting on a C sharp, and it goes all the way up to that F, but it does then stepwise down to the fourth of the scale, to the third of the scale. And you'd almost expect that it would go from there to the second of the scale, but it drops all the way down to the seventh. Kind of sneaks past where it might be going if it was a stepwise progression.
Well, that's a melody writing tip, I guess you'd say. It's an idea where it's we don't want the phrase to end yet, so we have to make sure that it doesn't feel like it's about to end. So we have to sort of take that arrival point that we know we're shooting for and just sort of overshoot it, go right past it.
Right.
So we can tell the listener, it's not done. We're not there yet.
The other option would be if it were going from 5 to 4 to 3 to 2, but the 2 is that flattened 2, which I think landing on that would sound odd and unstable. There you go. And then staying there. Staying there, actually, that's kind of clever. If you stay on that flat 2, in my ear, it's really wanting to draw back down to that 1. It's wanting to just take that half step and go from here to here. So if I ended on that note right there, I think singing wise and the way that my ear hears it, it wouldn't comfortably jump back up to the fifth of the scale. And that's also a tritone. It's an augmented fourth of a leap to get from that flat second up to the major fifth. And that's an awkward thing for people to hear and to sing. And traditionally, there's all sorts of music history around the tritone, even that it was considered evil or somehow the interval of the devil and stuff like that. But it's challenging to reach that. It's not part of that particular chord there. You're a half step away from one of the notes of the chord and then leaping up to a note of the chord. It's an awkward leap. So I think it makes more musical sense to not land there, to not go 5, 4, 3, 2, and stay there, because we're not just immediately going back down to 1. The next phrase starts with that 5. This is the next phrase then. And that phrase does walk all the way down the scale, but it doesn't spend a lot of time on that flat second.
Right. And so I guess it brings this concept of what we call tendency tones or tendency notes, whatever. It's these notes that, like this G natural here, that just so strongly want to go somewhere that they themselves no longer feel like they are stable or comfortable arrival points. And that actually, to our ears, it's sort of dissatisfying or awkward when they don't go where we think they're about to go.
Looking at the entire piece, looking at the entire melody from beginning to end, we are technically starting on the tonic, even though we leap away immediately. And we go up and we come back down a little bit. We go up a little bit and come back down, but not as far. Go up a little bit and come back down and not as far. And then we go up all the way an octave above where we started and gradually, similar to how we did previously, walk our way back down. In the first case, we walk our way back down and we miss the tonic. We go too far. And then finally, on the last 2 measures, we go from 5 back down to 1. And we're just going down the scale there, even though there's a little detour in the third and fourth beats where it does the eighth notes in that measure, it still goes from 5 to 1. That's what it sounds like here. And that's the end of the melody. It's that stretchiness. Starts out at a certain spot, reaches up a certain distance, and because of the tension that is there, from the starting point to the ending point, our ear wants the melody to pull back down to where it kind of started.
Yeah, it's definitely noteworthy that that final sort of resting F sharp is the only time we end a little phrase or even subphrase on F sharp. We start there and then we end there. We don't ever stop on it anywhere in between.
True. Yeah, that's a good point. And in a lot of the melodies we're looking at, but just in melodies in general, if you get to the final note and you're on the home chord, it sounds like it's done. And so if you do that in the middle of the piece, it doesn't necessarily sound as satisfying when you get to the end of the piece and you have it happen again. So if you get to that home note and everything's resolved nicely, when you're halfway through the song or halfway through a melody, you don't have the emotional satisfaction of when you finally get there at the end of the journey. Another thing I'm noticing here is it doesn't have the emphasis on the starting on one, but I'm going to kind of pretend that it does because the very first note of the piece is the F. And then the first phrase ends on the third of the scale, and it kind of focuses on the third. And then the last phrase really, we get to the peak of getting all the way up to the top of the scale again, but it really starts on the fifth and kind of, focuses on landing on the fifth. So we're kind of going 1, 3, 5 throughout the whole, structure of the melody, and then moving back down to 1.
And this, I think, is somewhat typical of traditional music. I don't know. I really don't know much about traditional Jewish music, but traditional music on the whole tends to prioritize these very, simple's not the right word. I don't want to undersell it, but very comfortable harmonies. Right? You've got your tonic harmony, you've got your third features a lot, your fifth a lot. You're not sort of throwing out these weird sort of chords like you might find in jazz and stuff. It's the very comfortable ones, and then the melodies tend to outline those.
Yeah. Well, kind of to use a different metaphor, because I've used the stair steps with the landings metaphor, but a completely different metaphor is the skeleton of a chord or of a scale. The skeleton of a scale is the chord that kind of resides under that scale. And as you're playing through a piece of music, the chords can change. So you're kind of landing with a different skeleton, and you can jump between the different notes of that. And anything in between is, it's kind of the tissue in between, or, it's stuff in addition to that framework that holds that scale together. And in this case, the whole folk song does, in fact, have a skeleton of being the F sharp major chord. And it's a very common thing in hymns and in again, because it's easy to sing, and because our ear, from the language of tonal music and the language of these scales, we have a major chord and we can hear that major chord. That's where we start out. That's where we finish. Any chords in between are just taking us away from that home chord and creating tension that then wants to resolve by coming back to that home chord. And that framework of having it land on the notes that are part of the chord, it's common, I think, because it makes it easier for people to be able to sing and hear.
Well, even just from a practical perspective, a lot of this music, this one included, will repeat this melody a few times. And so you don't want melodies or harmonies that are going to take you too far away from it, because you have to come right back to it.
Right.
To repeat it.
Yeah, so these are the kinds of things, for example, a hymn, the whole idea is that people can sing it really easily. They don't have to have any music education. They don't have any background. They can remember it. They can sing it. They can easily pick it up just from hearing it sung, once or twice for them. So you don't have to have any training on it. It's generally easy, but it's also pleasing. It's something that, I think the expectation, the understanding that it's going to follow certain rules is something that, is a pleasing thing to our brains. We like knowing that something is going to be a certain way. And when there's a little difference, when something's, we throw in an accidental, oh, that's interesting. But if you throw in too much of that, then it becomes something that isn't familiar. It becomes distant and alien and confusing. And part of why I think music makes people feel good in a lot of situations is because they have the expectation that things are going to sound a certain way. You got that expectation that you're going to land back at that home chord at some point. And then when you get there, it's satisfying. So you have the satisfaction of anticipating what something is going to happen and then having that anticipation be proven true.
Right. I think familiarity is something that applies to other things beyond music too. It's just something we as humans like.
Yeah, definitely outside of music, but I think it's really interesting that you can take these harmonic sounds, you can take these vibrations in the air, and they follow the same rules of aesthetics in certain ways as if we're doing something that is a visual art, whether it's a sculpture or a painting or something like that, or spoken art, again, poetry and things. You have these patterns that happen that create the same kind of interest and satisfaction. And there's so many different ways of doing those things. And every melody is different, but every melody seems to have things that are the same in them. There's always surprises and there's always things that are satisfying because they are familiar. I'm going to play the whole thing from beginning to end just so we can hear the entire arc of the melody. And then we can, if we notice anything else we want to talk about, we can talk about that. Here is, again, the entire melody from beginning to end. I definitely feel that first phrase, it is a 4-bar phrase. It just feels longer because it has that, the first two measures are they go down and then it jumps back up and comes down to the third. So it kind of goes in different directions. But that it is, the whole thing is a 6-bar phrase, whereas the second two measures are repeated. So earlier when we were talking about it being 6 bars with the last two repeated, I was miscounting.
It might be the slower tempo that was throwing us off too, but you're right. It is just 4 bars with a little 2-bar, sort of, I guess, mini little coda kind of thing.
Yeah. And it, again, looking at the whole thing overall, it does have an arc, even though it kind of leaps in the first place. It does have an overall arc that takes it up and brings it back down to home. I have a challenge still listening to this scale and not feeling like it isn't done. To me, it still sounds like it wants to resolve. I had assignments in college to write music that was different from traditional, and I tried to write music using this scale when I was back in college, and it ended up just being in the harmonic minor, where I ended up resolving back down a fifth from the tonic of this scale, just because I wasn't naturally feeling like this was resolved.
And some of that, I think, would be helped to our westernized ears to have some of the underlying harmony. I just don't know how much of that would have been traditional or is traditional to the original style. This is perhaps diverting a bit from the melody, but it kind of plays into it. I think a lot of this, looking at the sheet music we have, sort of implies there's sort of a drone going on underneath. So there's a drone, sort of like the same note is being repeated in the bass for long periods of time. And so that sort of goes with the idea that the melody leaps around a bunch and sort of walks up and down scales, but it always sort of lands back on these same few notes. It's sort of very locked in and doesn't wander too far from its home.
Anything else you'd like to say about the melody today?
And I think we've covered a lot of it. It's ultimately a fairly, like once you deconstruct it, fairly simple melody. It just happens to be in an unfamiliar mode. But it just, like you said, it follows a lot of the trends that we see in sort of church hymns or other very familiar tonal melodies.
Yeah. Well, thank you for bringing this melody to my attention. We're actually going to be hearing a little bit more of this melody. We're going to take a break first, and then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about what is going on with composer Aaron Lee. Welcome back to the Melodology podcast, celebrating the unsung excellence of melody makers. My name is Arthur Breur. I am your host, and I am here with Aaron Lee. We are just back from looking at a beautiful melody that, Aaron, you used in some of your own work. Tell us about this work.
So I wrote, I don't remember the year, it's 2018, a few years ago. It's been a long couple of years lately. Feels like it's been longer than that. As part of the choir I sing in, we were performing a concert, sort of an interfaith concert at a Jewish community center. And so as part of that, tasked to write a piece could be played there. So something that incorporated some Jewish culture with some westernized culture. So my approach was to see what other people had done, and Prokofiev's piece came up in my research. I just absolutely loved that middle melody in there, which is the one we just looked at. And so I went sort of pouring through and found the melody I liked and incorporated that into my own work, and then accompanying it with the text, because it's a choral work of a psalm. It had to be one of the psalms, so we were given some sort of restrictions as to what music and material we could perform within the sanctuary.
Right.
And the psalms were all fair game, and since they were used in both traditions, that's what I decided to focus on. But I didn't want to just take this melody and just use it the whole time, so that's not really, I felt like composing my own music anymore. It's an arrangement. So what I did was I sort of borrowed a tradition from Western music, especially Renaissance music, Western Renaissance, and that I took that melody, one we just analyzed, and used it as sort of what we would call a cantus firmus in sort of Western medieval Renaissance music. Essentially, it's a fancy way of saying that melody underlies a lot of the music that goes on. And so all the sort of surface level, the things you hear, are built on top of that so that they go well with it. And so that melody is actually forming a structure underneath. You do hear it a lot, but it's predominantly in the piano. And so it's also starts off the piece just with that. So if anyone who's familiar with the original tune would hear it.
Let's go ahead and listen to the opening of that, and you'll be able to hear the same melody, but also hear what it is that Aaron did with it for this choral arrangement.
I will start off by saying I don't use the entire melody. I just use that first 4-bar phrase. Though I actually, remember how we talked about it was 4 bars and there's a little extra 2-bar addendum? I sort of smush those together and I use the first 2 bars and the last 2 bars. I skip that sort of middle 2.
Yeah, and then you're using essentially that first motif as the beginning of the song, and it repeats that same motif in the various different voices.
Right, and so yeah, that's, to me, when I first listened to the melody, that opening 5th leap was that sort of key identifying feature. And to me, especially in music like this, that's what we call sort of contrapuntal. So there's multiple melodies and lines going on simultaneously, overlapping here and there. To me, one of the helpful things when writing that music is to have that really distinctive opening, that thing that immediately says, oh yeah, this is that thing I was hearing.
Mm-hmm.
And so having everything start with that fifth leap up, I think just made it much easier to latch onto orally.
Even at the very beginning right here, you have it leaping up and coming down one step, but then leaping up and coming down to the third. So it kind of gets a little resolution before you bring in all the voices together.
Right, and I guess I will point out that we talked briefly about harmony and how the original one had fairly simple harmony where it sort of sticks to the 1-3-5 of that home. Because I was basing my version off the Prokofiev version, the harmony I use is more in line with what Prokofiev would have done, in that very few phrases end in the same key they started.
Yeah, Prokofiev is notorious, not just musically for having an interesting change as the melody is going along, but notorious for instrumentalists because he will have an entire section of a piece of music that you have to be able to play. This fast technical piece that you've got to get and you have to get it into your fingers. And then he'll shift the whole thing a half step. So not only do you have to learn it once, you have to learn the whole thing twice, and you have to learn it in a slightly different position. Something he's known for. Do it again a half step away.
And I like that about the music, in this, which is why I don't do the second half of the phrase here. So I sort of start the first phrase, and then I treat that the stuff we arrive on as, oh, that's good, that's home now, and then we just move on, repeating that. So we gradually move away from our starting area.
And there was another part of this that you wanted to listen to as well at about 3:38.
Yeah, so this, I'll preface it by saying this is the choral a cappella section. This is where the chorus actually does get to just do the melody themselves. And then we're back into the piano leading.
And it is really beautiful, and that motif does, it is a hook. It is definitely an attractive and recognizable interval and motif to use, and that does give it a solid identity to the piece.
You said like it's common in film music too. I wonder how much of that is just, yes, it has that heroic sound, but also it's very distinctive. Like when we're talking about a piece that requires motifs so much, such as film scoring, just being able to get something in someone's ear and say, remember this in 2 or 3 notes, it's a big deal.
Yeah, that is part of why pop music has hooks to it in the first place. And a lot of times it's the chord progression itself that is kind of the hook. You hear an interesting chord progression that isn't quite the way it normally would be, or you have very fast chord progressions, so you can have a number of chords squeezed into 1 or 2 measures, and that becomes distinct. That is a very identifiable sound on that opening motif.
I suppose I should double back quickly. I'm just remembering this now. Just to point out to listeners, for that recording, you weren't hearing wrong in just not hearing the women. That was entirely a men's choir. Nothing higher than a tenor.
All right. And you had another piece that you wanted to share as well. Tell us about Faux Pas de Deux.
So this was the piece I wrote. It's for saxophone quartet, just to show that I can incorporate, or anyone can, it's not a unique skill to me, but melody into multiple lines. And it's that going back to sort of the contrapuntal, sort of almost inspired by Bach in general, the idea that you've got these melodies running and each line has its own melody and sort of its own contour and stuff going on. And that you can combine a bunch of those together to create a new whole without sacrificing sort of the individuality of the lines. So I took that to a bit of an extreme in this, where I took one of the Bach Well-Tempered Clavier pieces, it's the second prelude from the second book, and I just spread it out and just wrote it out as a 4-part chorale, essentially, at 1/16 the original speed.
Oh,
so every 16th note became a whole note. And then I took that as the sort of fundamental chord progression now, of a new piece that I orchestrated out and gave complex melodies to everyone. And so the end result doesn't sound a ton like the Bach most of the time, but, with snippets here and there. But I think one of the things I really played around was the idea of different meters and tempos, so that not all of the instrumentalists are playing in precisely the same meter. So they're not all, for example, playing in 4/4, even though that's what it's written in. And so you've got these melodies that are all very independent and sort of change up at will, and yet somehow all collectively combine in to create this sort of pseudo Bach piece. Yeah, a lot of the time I think when especially as composers, when we talk about music, we'll talk about things in terms of vertical and horizontal, which is reference to the way it looks on a page, nothing about, us hearing it as vertical or horizontal. It's just the way it's written. So we'll talk about vertical as being the harmonies, the things that sort of line up. And then we'll talk about horizontal, which is the melodies. So the individual lines and how they weave around. And so we'll talk about how different composers, different styles are sort of prioritized one over the other, perhaps. And Bach is definitely one of those ones that, to me at least, is very much about the horizontal. It's about the melodies sort of weaving in and out of each other.
All right, so let's listen to the beginning of Faux Pas de Deux.
This is sort of representative of a lot of the work. It does have occasionally snippets of direct quotations. For the most part, it's just this very elaborate reorchestration and sort of taking what was a melody, turning it into harmony, and then taking that harmony and making it new melody.
For the feel or flavor of the music, did you have any particular thing you were trying to make it sound like or reference?
When listening to sort of contemporary music, I do like the styles of orchestration that you get in a lot of sort of minimalist or post-minimalist or whatever ism you want to get into. But that style where it's a lot of rhythmic stuff, and so that's what I tried to go for here. Although it's not minimalist in the sense that, stuff's changing quite quickly. That idea that you just got stacked independent things that are just going on, not really caring much whether or not they line up perfectly with the one above them, just that they're all obeying the same outlined harmony.
It does have the sound of minimalist music. I wouldn't say that the starting of minimalist music, it has a sound of, for example, John Adams or Michael Torquay, where you've got repeated things, or it sounds like they're repeated things and there's patterns, but they don't necessarily just, every couple measures repeat exactly the same thing for a long period of time with a slight change. It's not an early Philip Glass kind of minimalism.
Okay, I sort of create this system that I've used in other works where I've got repeating patterns in all the voices, but rhythmic patterns that do get elaborated or varied quite a bit, but repeating patterns, and I make them all different lengths. So one of the voices has a 5-quarter note repeating pattern. One of them has a 3-note for 3 beats. One of them 7. So like things that don't line up nicely. So they've all got patterns that are repeating, but at different times, but then syncing them all up to the same harmony that might be on every bar, so that it doesn't get sort of too cacophonic.
You can hear the repeating things, but you can also hear that there's something different happening because they're not repeating together.
Right.
Because they are different lengths and sizes, you end up, as they are playing the same thing, each part playing the same thing, the notes that are stacked on top of each other align and create different harmonies with each other every single time they're repeating. So if you try and listen to one of those parts and you're just listening to that part and you catch it going over and over, even though it's the same notes over and over, its surroundings are completely different because the other patterns are not repeating at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's one of the fun things about prioritizing sort of melodic or horizontal movement in something is that you can create these little melodies that are recontextualized every time you hear them.
It's kind of like just reharmonizing something. You can take a melody that has the chords that you expect, and you can take that exact same melody and play chords that you completely wouldn't expect to make it sound completely different. And the melody is exactly the same notes, but because you give it this different environment around it, the melody can sound completely different. You can take a happy melody and make it sound sad, or a sad melody and make it sound happy, or whatever. You just make each note sound completely different functionally than it was originally in kind of the standard harmonization that it has. It's happening sort of by default because you have these repeating patterns on top of each other and living in different environments as the parts around it are changing.
Yeah, I guess it's that sort of thing we were talking about with the other melody. It's just that balance between familiarity and sort of novelty.
Yeah. What's coming up for you? What are you working on?
I am currently finishing up my doctoral dissertation.
Congratulations.
So, thank you. So I'm now at the stage where it's all written. It's just that final bit of proofreading. So fingers crossed, won't be too much longer.
Excellent.
And so that was an opera, a 2-act opera.
Excellent. And is that being performed, or has it been performed?
It is not as of yet scheduled to be performed, but hopefully soon. It's modest in terms of instrumentation and performing forces, so it should hopefully be doable. But I know that, with recent events, these kinds of performances are trickier to schedule than they were before.
Yeah. What's the instrumentation and what's the number of voices?
It's a chamber ensemble, so it's single winds and single strings with an audio technician, so a soundtrack part, and an electric guitar.
How long is the whole thing going to be?
With intermission, it's about 2 hours.
So a full opera.
Yeah. And
That's excellent.
4 soloists and then a chorus of 4 people, which is actually intended to just be all pre-recorded ahead of time. So
awesome. Aaron, thank you very much for being here today. It has been a pleasure talking about a different melody, a different kind of melody than what we've already listened to. And it's been a pleasure talking to you and hearing about your experiences and what it is that you are doing.
Thank you.
Tell listeners how they can find you.
So you can check out my works, including arrangements or original works, on my website, musicoflee.com. And I'm on Twitter at the same handle, Music of Lee.
And Twitter. That's Lee.
Lee, yes. I guess it's true. It's important to spell it.
And this is the Melodology Podcast. The Melodology Podcast is at melodologypodcast.com or on the social medias as Melody Podcast. I am your host, Arthur Breur. Breur is spelled Breur. 5 letters and the last 3 look like the start of Europe. And that's all of my social media is just Arthur Breur. Thank you for joining us on the Melodology Podcast, celebrating the unsung excellence of melody makers.